maybe some context. At least from my perspective, I'll say, right? So like all of us that were in the indie scene and Ozone and in, guys that were even other guys that were signed to Ruckus or Fondulum or all the whole stretch of Bobito movement that was in the late 90s here. Almost everybody was from New York, maybe from some other major cities like Chicago or Philly or Boston or LA, but like New York was the beginning of the indie scene. And New York was still also the birthplace of hip hop, which was only like 20 years beforehand, 25 years beforehand. So it was still all very new. I don't think anybody walked around consciously like New York, New York, New York, but I think that was just the way that we came up in hip hop, living here. And I think when you have, and I'll speak for myself, you can take what you want from the record and the context that it sounds like he's talking, but like for me, as a New York fan, as a New York resident, it was like, who are these guys? Who is this guy from not from here, like from fucking New England or wherever the fuck, that moved to the Bay? Like, who is this? What the fuck? And the approach to like the Anticon stuff was very different than the New York approach.
Right.
And it wasn't something that I don't think anyone in New York expected. I mean, we knew about like, the blowed out in LA, about Freestyle Fellowship and Good Life and all that stuff. And we knew about the Bay, we knew about like hieroglyphics and, Hobo Junction and other, indie movements that were going on in these different places, ABB Records in LA, like places like that. Um, you know, but it was very new for essentially what felt like, and I'm going to say this a little bit ignorantly because I don't know the specific histories of everybody in Anticon, where they're from, and I can't even make a judgment on where they're from versus where they're not from. But like that sound of hip hop to me translated to a much more suburban kind of sound than
Right.
what other indie hip hop was. I think that's a fair statement to make
No, it is.
about
It
how we
is.
felt at the time. You know what I'm saying? And I think part of the reason why I can listen to Dear LP now and get it more is because I'm used to that sound. I'm used to the way that people from that origin, sound now. There's a lot of people that sound like that. At the time in 1999, when you heard the way Soul's delivery was, fast and a little bit more high pitched, it didn't sound like what we were used to in the first place. So it was almost
Right.
like an extra diss, where it was like, what the, how dare he? What I mean? And that was the way that, like, that's the way I felt, you know what I'm saying? Like, and again, like, Elle and Len felt strongly enough to make a diss record. So obviously they had their own feelings, whether they exactly line up with mine as the guy just sitting there hitting record or not, or the guy that was the fan or not. Because that was my perspective, was the super fan that was hitting record. And I think to some degree that's an important piece of context just because maybe that explains a little bit of like why that song was so brutal and so harsh, as a reply. And I think it also kind of gives a little bit of context to why somebody might want to make a DRLP kind of song in the first place, because New York was such a place full of like bravado and arrogance and toughness that there's always going to be a pushback on one movement by another movement. And I think
No,
in a wider view, maybe it was more than just like L and Soul. Maybe it was just like these two styles of indie hip hop needed to have friction before they worked out how to move forward. And like obviously what came later was Jux and what came later was Rhymesayers and like Anticon with a much bigger roster and other labels out west and what have you. And all of those labels happily for the most part coexisted for a decade later after all of this started. But I think there was a friction at first. You know what I mean? It's like hot air meeting cold air. Like there's
no,
gonna be a tornado first, and then everything settles down.
right. Oh, and that's the other thing too, is like, again, like you said earlier, listening to Dear LP, because I'll be honest, until very recently, I never listened to it because I'm like,
Mm.
it's um, because I that's the battle part of me that still
Right.
exists
Yeah.
to a point. Like, I'm like, wow, I'm a company flow fan. That Linda Tripp's hard as fuck. There's no way that this
Right.
song could,
Yeah. It was
even touch
impossible.
it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but then I was like, well, if we're gonna talk about this at a certain point, I gotta go back
Yeah.
and like really like from an artist perspective and from a co-host perspective, I gotta get both sides. And like you, like the same thing. I'm like, you know what? This song isn't that bad.
Yeah. For sure.
25 years later or whatever it is, um, and like you said, some of the lines hit, some of the lines didn't, and
Hmm.
but I also my main point is that's where you see the levels, right? Because there's some things that I said in Linda Tripp that you had to be super knowledgeable on,
Mm.
old school rap shit or a specific time period. So it was almost like he was like, I'm giving you a lesson because this is
Right.
where I came from,
Yeah.
and you're the outsider coming looking
Yes.
in now. And so I think that's where it came from too,
And
which is
to me, that's my thing is like whether it's conscious or subconscious, like everything that I talked about as far as like the New York versus outsider, the sounds, the way that the indie movement was gonna go, all of that stuff kind of played into this song in a way that was sort of in the background that I don't think that the participants maybe even realized at the time, but now 25 years later, being a fly on the wall, I can kind of say that that might have been part of it.
no, I mean it makes sense when you look at it from that context and from that point of view. I mean, again, as younger guys, maybe they didn't have the self-awareness at the time to think like that, but I mean, things happen subconsciously all the time, and then you don't realize until later, like, oh shit,
Yeah,
that's why I did that.
yeah,
So,
yeah, for sure.